Welcome to the Michael Shermer Show. I'm your host, Michael Shermer. Before I introduce today's guest, this episode is brought to you by Wondrium.com. Wondrium, Wondrium.com. It's the former teaching company, The Great Courses. In addition to all their great courses, and they are great, you can now subscribe to the service. I've been with this company for so long, I used to rent their courses. They would mail out cassette tapes and then DVDs. And now, of course, like everybody else, they're streaming online. It's a subscription service. So you can subscribe, pay a monthly fee, and you get access to all their content, and not just the courses, but they've partnered up with other companies that produce content as well. So it's kind of a one-stop shop for all the intellectual content you could ever imagine. And you can consume it while you're driving, cycling, hiking, walking, vacuuming, weeding, whatever. It's all the thing. Everybody's been doing it, particularly since the pandemic. So give it a try. Here's one I'm going to take. This sounds pretty interesting. Extreme Offenders, Psychological Insights. The names are infamous. The crimes are extreme. The insights into the darkest corners of behavioral psychology and the disturbing ways that serial killers think and act. And this is 12 episodes in this series. Each is about 30 minutes long. You can listen to them at I listened to them at 1.2 speed, so it's about a little over 20 minutes for each of them. And oh boy, he gets into John Wayne Gacy, Jeffrey Dahmer, Dracula delusions, cruelty and lust murder, Peter Curtin, and so Ted Bundy. Oh boy, they're all in here. So I'm going to probably queue this up for my bike ride this afternoon and give it a shot. And you should too. So here's the deal. If you want to support the podcast, support Wondrium. Go to Wondrium.com/Shermer and you get a 1 month free trial. That is a monthly subscription service. You can try it out for a month for free. Just go to Wondrium.com, Wondrium.com/Shermer, Shermer, and you get a free trial. If you like it, and why wouldn't you? You should continue subscribing. And if you don't, well, nothing lost. All right, give it a listen, and thanks for listening and supporting the show. My guest today is Dr. Nancy Siegel, who has a new book. I have the kind of big printed version here called Deliberately Divided, Inside the Controversial Study of Twins and Triplets Reared Apart. Dr. Siegel is professor in the Department of Psychology at California State University, Fullerton, my alma mater. And she's the director of the Twins Study Center, which she founded in 1991, which is now the world's leading center for twin studies. Nancy is the author of 6 books on twins, including the most recent ones. First, Accidental Brothers, the story of twins exchanged at birth, and The Power of Nature and Nurture. Twin Myth Conceptions, False Beliefs, Fables, and Facts About Twins. Born Together, Reared Apart, the landmark Minnesota twin study. Indivisible by Two, Lives of Extraordinary Twins and Entwined Lives, Twins and What They Tell Us About Human Behavior. She's the senior editor of Uniting Psychology and Biology, Integrative Perspectives on Human Development. And she's also an associate editor of Twin Research and Human Genetics, the official journal of the International Society for Twin Studies. You'll be familiar with Nancy as you've probably seen her on the Today Show, Good Morning America 2020, Oprah Winfrey Show, The Martha Stewart Show, Discovery Health, and The Diane Rehm Show on NPR. She is the world's leading expert on twins, so whenever twin issues come up, they always go to Nancy. This book talks about this incredible story of this New York adoption agency who deliberately divided twins, and in one case triplets, and sent them to separate families, which they selected to optimize testing nature versus nurture without telling the parents that that's what they were doing. And of course, the twins themselves were infants, so they never knew. And then how that unfolded decades later when the twins started to find each other, and just incredible stories of how that happened. So we spent a lot of time on that study, the ethics of it. It was quite unethical. But I also have her give us a brief history of twin research, going back to Francis Galton in the 19th century, of course, Joseph Mengele during the Holocaust, and then some of the research on twins after that, how the research protocols and ethical protocols have improved considerably since that time. And then what we can discern from twin research, that is identical twins raised apart versus in the same home versus adopted children raised in the same home versus siblings raised in the same home, and so on and so forth, and what it means to say something is heritable or it's genetic, and how do we think about the non-shared environment that's neither genes nor environment exactly. That has to do with the particular unique contingent pathway of life that each of us goes through. How many genes that goes into things like height and personality traits, intelligence, and so forth, epigenetics and gene expression. But mostly we focus on these incredible twin examples and the triplets, and the frustrating part being that most of the data that was collected on these twins is locked away until 2065. Astonishing. So they knew that they were doing something wrong. And by the time that became clear, when the ethical standards especially became much more rigorous, the researchers locked that away and we can't get at it. But Nancy got enough of it that she could tell this incredible story. Her book, again, Deliberately Divided. It's a great read, and I hope you enjoyed this conversation. And if you appreciate the podcast as usual, please go to skeptic.com/donate and give us some support that way. Your donations are tax deductible because we're a 501c3 nonprofit. All right. Thanks for listening. This is a super interesting conversation. I hope you enjoy it. How are you?
Nice to see you, Michael.
Yes,
I'm just
indeed.
fine. How are you?
Everything is
Yeah.
good. I always love your research, your books. You always find the most peculiar, interesting, quirky things to write about related to genetics and behavior genetics and twins. And I have to say, this one
Well,
is off the charts, just unbelievable, fascinating, just disturbing. It's like an order of magnitude weirder and more interesting than anything you've done before. Just amazing.
Michael, you use the word weird and peculiar and quirky. I don't think those words belong in this particular book. This is a really tragic episode in the history of twin research, and I think one that needed a lot of exposure. And I'm really glad that I was the one to do it.
Totally, absolutely. Well, before we get into that, this is the book that kind of dives into this twin experiment that was conducted in the 50s, 60s, and I guess into the 70s, or maybe later. But
Yes,
before we
yes.
do that, just give our listeners a background about yourself. That is to say, give us a brief bio. Where were you born and raised, and how did you get involved in the famous Minnesota Twins reared apart study, and how you ended up becoming the world's leading expert on twins?
Yeah. Well, I'm Dr. Nancy Siegel. I was born in Boston, Massachusetts, and then we moved to Philadelphia when I was a young child, and then New York City when I was 5. So I grew up there. And I went to college at Boston University and then had the great fortune to be accepted at the University of Chicago, which is a school I just love. And I got interested in twin studies in large part because I am a twin. I'm a fraternal same sex twin and was always so fascinated with why my sister and I were so different and why we weren't close like the identical twins I knew at school. And I kind of intuited that she and I had something very fundamentally different about us, but I was never quite sure what that was until I began to study genetics in college. And I remember that when I was a senior, I was asked to write a paper about some aspect of personal adjustment. And so I wrote about the time that my sister and I were separated for the first time in school in a 4-year-old kindergarten class. And it was traumatic for me, but not for her. And that experience just burned itself into my brain. And I began to write about that from a personal perspective, but also I delved into the literature and I found that I enjoyed it immensely. I just resonated to it. So I pursued twin research in graduate school and the rest is history. And then in 1979, Professor Bouchard of Minnesota launched the famous Minnesota study of twins raised apart, and he had two postdoctoral positions open. And I knew that one of them just had to be mine. And luckily it was. And from there, I went to California State University, Fullerton, where I established a twin research study center that supports my research and that of my colleagues and students and acts as a sort of a dissemination center for twin research interviews and information for the public. And I just love it. And as you say, I've written about a number of topics, and this one is a little different than the others, and I can't wait to talk to you about it.
Yeah, yeah, no, totally. So you must get email and correspondence almost daily since you're the kind of public face of twin research now. What's that like?
I do, Michael. I get emails every single day with people telling me their own twin stories or tell me about an interesting pair or sending me a newspaper article. And I have to say that I love it because while I try to stay on top of it, it's easy to miss things. And some of those random emails have led to enormous opportunities for me. I mean, if I hadn't gotten an email from somebody, I never would have gone to Colombia in South America to study the switched at birth double pair that were raised in Bogota and up in the north. So that was fantastic. So these things are appreciated, and I will say that I reply to every single email. I make it my business to reply to every mother, professor, twin, anyone who contacts me. One or two have been a little weird that I've disregarded, but I reply to every single one.
I love those documentary clips and media coverage of your research where you are there with the twins when they're reunited for the first time, and I recall one of them was like an airport, and uh, and the tears are flowing, and that must be quite the experience to see that happening.
It's a very moving experience. I see those things in person and I see them in clips, and I see them many times over, and every time my eyes just water. They're so moving, so gleeful, so joyful. The twins look at each other in amazement, in disbelief, and they touch each other's faces and their own face to see what's matching. It's really extraordinary, really extraordinary.
So let's talk about the. There's so much jargon in this story. The different kinds of twins and the different options there are of being separated and raised apart, reared together, identical, unidentical, accidentally switched, and I mean, there's just so many variations that you don't think of.
Oh, there are people think in terms of identical and fraternal, but within each type, there are so many variations. And as you say, the classic twin method is identical twins raised together compared to fraternal twins raised together. If the identicals are more alike with respect to a certain trait, this gives us some demonstration that genetic influences are involved. We can study twins raised apart who've had no contact with one another to get a pure estimate of genetic influence. We can study identical twins where one has schizophrenia or manic depressive illness or some medical condition and try to figure out why that twin has it and the other one doesn't if they have the same genes. And then switch to birth twins, where twins are born in a hospital same time as a single baby, and due to medical negligence, they're switched. And so an unrelated pair grows up in the twins family thinking that they are fraternal twins, and the single twin grows up in a family believing they're a non twin child. And usually, if they're identical and they don't live too far apart, somebody will confuse one for the other, and that will lead to the reunion, as happened with the Colombian four. But you can imagine, Michael, that if fraternal twins are switched at birth, it's not as easy to happen because they don't look alike, so they're not going to be confused. I suspect that there are many more fraternal twins out there that are separated at birth. And I say that because about 15 years ago, there were two independent studies conducted by private companies who determined that thousands of misplacements in hospitals in the US occur every year, but they're corrected. But you've got to imagine that even if they're corrected, there have to be some that aren't. So I suspect that there are twins out there. And, I just published a paper on a pair of twins who were related just through the father. And that's another thing we could talk about, another variation on the theme. Some fraternal twins, and we don't know how many, don't have the same father because if a woman releases two eggs, there is a window of opportunity for fertilization to happen, 3 to 4 days. And sperm are also viable for a couple of days. So if she has sexual relations with two different men, those twins can actually have separate fathers. And so they're really genetic half siblings. And they can, if there's enough of them, they could play havoc with our heritability estimates.
Oh man, right. So logistically, how in the world does that happen at these hospitals? Don't they have like computer chips on the wristbands of the baby and the mother, and to prevent this kind of thing?
Yeah, well, a lot of them do, but those things are subjected to human error, and babies have very small wrists and they can fall off. I when I was studying a pair of switch twins in the Canary Islands a couple of years ago, I spoke to this wonderful man, a pediatrician who lives in Madrid, and he had this wonderful system. He said that newborn babies, as long as they're healthy, should be fingerprinted 20 minutes after they're born. and mother's fingerprints, of course, can be obtained. Fingerprints are stable, reliable characteristics, and then you simply compare the fingerprints upon hospital discharge. And a number of South American countries have adopted that system. We don't have that in the United States.
Astonishing. Wow.
It certainly is. Certainly is. A
Let's
lot
talk.
of parents have
Let's
told me
talk
that
about.
they want videotapes in the delivery room.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So let's talk about the some of the myths surrounding this and just kind of misunderstandings of what some of these words mean, like heritable and genetic, and you'll read something like in a paper by you, well, 50% of the variance was accounted for by their genes, and then people will read that and think, well, so 50% of my height is determined by genes, or 50% of my religiosity is heritable, but you don't mean 50% of genes, or 50% of the trait is determined by genes. So just walk us through the kind of the basic understandings of these terms.
Yeah. Well, first of all, let's just say that in a person, genes and environments are inextricably intertwined, and so you cannot assign a percentage at the individual level. When we talk about a 50% genetic influence, we mean variability in a population. If I were to measure extroversion in a population, a sample representing a population, there'd be individual differences from person to person, variation. And so about half that variation might be due to the genes and half due to the environment. But a particular person in that population could be extremely different. Maybe the extroversion was caused totally by the environment. So, yeah, and there's no such thing as, a gene for personality. I mean, personality is a very complex human trait. And of course, there are many, many genetic factors and environmental ones that underlie personality traits.
Right. So even simple things like height, which is highly heritable, still has probably thousands of genes influencing
Oh,
it. In
yes,
as much as you
absolutely.
have so many parts of
Absolutely.
your body that are all growing at the same time, influenced by different genes. So this long for search for the gene for gayness or whatever for being a Republican, is just a fool's errand. It's just not that simple.
Yeah, and I think that that's a great disappointment to molecular biologists who thought that once the human genome was unraveled, these things would be a matter of simplicity. Turns out it's a lot more complicated than anybody would have suspected.
Wasn't there something about even something as simple as height? Of all our understanding of the genetics that go into height, we can only account for like 20% of the variance or something like that. There's still so much we don't even know
Yeah,
even about something that simple.
yeah, it's a very small proportion of the variance. But given,
Yeah.
that we're only able to predict a small part of the variance through genetic factors, 20% is not trivial.
Well, that's true. Particularly when you're looking for variables in social science research, most of which doesn't account for much of anything and still gets published. But so then let's think about how genes could influence certain things that come up in your research. I recall one of your earlier papers of the twins that both used the same imported toothpaste from Sweden, Vatamicum, I think it was called. How in the world could
Try to make
genes have
them.
anything to do with preferences for toothpaste or the kind of clothes you wear or
Well,
who you pick as a spouse or which political party you gravitate toward?
well, if you think about the toothpaste example, Michael, it's a good question. And think about what goes into a choice of toothpaste. So it could be the taste that you like, could be the cost that you like. Maybe you're the kind of person that likes to try unusual things. And so these things at some level have some genetic input. And so as long as vademecum is in the environment of those two separated twins, as long as they can get a hold of it, then, we all gravitate towards the things that we like, the things that please us. And so I think it's that similarity, that similar genetic predisposition that leads the twins to that particular choice. What I like about those kinds of similarities, and I'm actually working on a paper on these unusual twin similarities, is that they give us a whole new way of thinking about behavior. A lot of us have odd habits, odd quirks, things that we do, and we think, well, we just sort of develop them. But if you think about it, if you had an identical twin somewhere, they might be doing exactly what you're doing because there are certain rituals that may feel comfortable to you. And so I think it gives us a whole new way and appreciation for why we are the way that we are, even when it comes down to these odd habits.
Right. So maybe genes code for proteins, which code for different neurochemical transmitter substances, ratios, or hormones, or whatever. So I have a certain kind of temperament. I prefer an ordered, hierarchical worldview that's very predictable, because that's what makes me feel comfortable when I get up in the morning and get around. I want my day to be outlined and predictable. Now, which political party am I going to gravitate toward? Well, I'm going to like those conservatives because they're more hierarchical, structured. They want to conserve traditional institutions. And those liberals always want to change things, and I don't like too much change. So I'm not really selecting political party based on their platform or the planks or their particular issues. I just want to hang out with people that I like, that are like me. And so you end up, kind of gravitating toward, one, and this could apply to religion or whatever.
Yeah, well, that makes perfect sense. At some level, these things have a genetic basis in your intelligence, in your personality, how you process information. And we know that people tend to associate with those who are like them. If you look at friendship correlations and spouse correlations, you see that people tend to select more on behavioral traits as opposed to physical ones. So everything you're saying makes complete sense to me. And, individuals differ, but on the other hand, when the message comes from the group, as you know, and so the group tells us that genetic influence on party beliefs or attitudes to social issues does have a partial genetic component.
Right. So some of your twins, I recall, they dress similarly. What has genes got to do with that? Well, I guess if you have a certain body type and you look in the mirror and you're at the clothing store, you think, well, I like the black shirt with the blue blazer, and your twin, he's looking at the same thing. Well, I look better in the black blue blazer and the black shirt, whatever. And they end up gravitating towards similar clothes. And then people like you document that, and and then that's what makes it on television. Like, look, they dress the same. But there's a kind of a logic to it.
Well, there is a logic to it, and I think it's not just the colors that look good on you or the body physique, but the certain materials feel comfortable. Some people don't like to wear wool because it's itchy or scratchy, and what you can afford to buy. That's another thing. Are you somebody who keeps up with fashion or somebody who just likes traditional kinds of styles? So a lot of this goes into our choice of clothing, and I think that that's why, again, these twin similarities are compelling, but they're not just, oh my God, gee whiz phenomena. I think they're real scientific data because they really force us to think carefully about what goes into our choices.
Yeah. So before we get into the details of your book, could you just walk us through a brief history of the interest in twins and research, starting with Francis Galton and up to the darker Joseph Mengele, and then into this particular study in New York City.
Yeah. Well, Sir Francis Galton is credited with being the father of the twin method, who correctly realized that if you compare look-alike twins, see, we didn't have identical versus fraternal in the late 1800s because the genetics had not been worked out. But he correctly surmised that look-alike twins shared their heredity, as he called it, and fraternal twins did not. And he solicited correspondence from many, many people about twins and organized them by the look-alikes and the non-look-alikes. And his conclusion was that nature prevails enormously over nurture. And he was actually a little astounded by his findings. As the years went on, people began to understand the difference between identical and fraternal twins once we worked out uh, the principles of genetic transmission. And then twin studies did take a very dark and dangerous turn, as you say, during the Holocaust with Joseph Mengele, because he solicited twins. He looked at them as they entered Auschwitz on the railroad ramp and subjected them to these horrific medical experiments, just horrendous. Twinship saved many of these people initially because they were needed for experimentation, but ultimately they were no safer than anybody else. One of his favorite tricks was to inject one twin with typhus and not the other, kind of a bizarre experiment in co-twin control, and then just see what happens. So the Nazi period left a very nasty legacy for twin research, and behavioral genetics, the science that looks at the genetic transmission of behavior, was a very controversial area for many years, was not admitted to the mainstream of psychology until 1980. And of course, you had not just the Nazi legacy that impeded behavioral genetics progress, but you had the women's rights movement. and you had civil rights, voting laws. You had a lot of these things that were working towards equality and away from the idea that genes could somehow influence behavior or development. But then what happened was at the same time, genetics was developing as a field. And so they were tying genes to, or chromosomal anomalies to Down syndrome and tying genetic effects to phenylketonuria. And animal studies were exploding. People found that you could breed mice to be maize dull and maize bright. So there was just enough compelling evidence at the time that people had to keep an open mind. And so eventually the evidence just got too persuasive. And, I think the thing is that you have to present a balanced view. I always love the quotation from Dubchansky that differences are not deficits. And it's just simple, but it gives it across, gives the message across so well that they're not. They're just differences, and what might be an advantage in one situation may be a detriment in another. As long as you keep the value judgments out of it, which I know is hard for some people, but you've got to keep the value judgments out of it. And then I think we can all sort of play this game on more equal footing.
There's a long history of this kind of association with twin research and then behavior genetics and genetics in general with eugenics and race science and twin research has this kind of darker affiliation, which thankfully for people like you that you've moved it away from that, but that kind of a political affiliation of the right and far right and race science and all that has made it really difficult. Even I just had Paige Harden on the show for her book, and it was necessary for her publisher to put right on the book, the cover, she's a liberal. And she says that behavior genetics is important research, as if that needs to be said like it's a team sport. And, it would be nice if we could get away from that, but it seems like that dark history is following that research still now.
Oh, yeah, well, I think you're right, but I do think that the people are being persuaded, the critics are being persuaded somewhat. Of course, there'll always be the diehard critics out there, but the data are just too compelling. I mean, if you're a careful scientist and you're somebody who's not a scientist but reads information very carefully, I think you can understand that genetics has an influence, but genes do not work in deterministic ways, they work in probabilistic ways. And I think that part of the problem, Michael, is the way we communicate this to people who are non-scientists. I think that there are many fine journalists out there, but some journalists talk in more black and white terms, such that, you know, genes cause this, or there is a gene for personality or a gene for schizophrenia, when in fact that's nonsense. And the idea of heritability that we talked about before. So there's a lot of misinformation out there. And in my book, Twin Misconceptions, I tried to correct some of that, but I don't know how many people got a hold of that. But there's a lot of misinformation out there. I try to correct it as much as I can, but it's very hard to. I mean, here's the simplest comparison. How do you explain identical twins raised apart are more alike than fraternal twins raised together? See, how do you explain that without reference to a genetic explanation? I don't see how. No one's ever been able to satisfy my request to do that.
Well,
And that's
because
a
it's
comparison that's not
obvious what
usually
the
made.
answer is.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, you mentioned in the
It's obvious to
first
you, Michael,
chapter of your new book.
but a lot of people could.
Yes. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, that's right.
I mean, a lot of people.
Well, again, I think there's also, we're not used to thinking, our cognitive psychology is not evolved to think in terms of population probabilities. People, when they hear heritability, they think of myself, just one. How can one person be 60% this or 40% that? And instead, you would say something. No, we're talking about like 100 twin pairs, and here's the amount of variation we can account for by genetics and so on. But our minds are not intuitively tied to thinking along the lines of 100 people. They think of, well, one person. I think that's part of the problem. There's a
Yeah,
cognitive shift there.
yeah.
But so
I would agree, and I think it's back to how we communicate things. Yeah, I agree, and I think it's how we communicate information. It has to be made very, very simple and very clear.
yeah, well, you do that. You're the best at that. In your first chapter of your new book, you do mention your own doctoral research on twins and children, whether they cooperated or more competitive. So just explain, use that as an example of how you would tease apart these variations and their influences.
Well, actually, in that particular study, which was the subject of my doctoral dissertation, I was interested in twin relationships. And so I watched identical twin children working on a common task, puzzle completion, compared to fraternal twins. And I found that given the same instructions, same setup, the identical twins were much more cooperative with one another than fraternals. What I concluded was that their similar information processing strategies, abilities, um, personalities, all those things kind of came together, genetically based in part, to allow greater cooperation and synchrony in that particular task in fraternals. And I think there's take home messages to that. Why do certain sibling or parent child coalitions in some families get along better than others? Why do we work better with some people than others? I'm not saying that we shouldn't try to mend relations with people who we feel friction with, because we have to do that. There's such a thing as family loyalty and coworker loyalty, but at least perhaps we can understand a little better what the problems are. And understanding a problem is, I think, the first step towards ameliorating it.
Then there's still this unexplained element. Sometimes I guess it's called the non-shared environment. So you have, say, identical twins raised in the same home, and the parents do everything they can to treat them exactly the same, and they're not. So it's not genetics, not environment, it's something else, the so-called non-shared environment, whatever that means.
Yeah. Well, the non-shared environment is defined as the idiosyncratic individual events that people in a family experience apart from one another that does influence personality and many other traits. And they don't work in systematic ways, so they're difficult to get a handle on. But it might be something like reading an amazing book or taking a vacation or being assaulted or winning the lottery. It could be a lot of different things like that. And in fact, I often tell parents, I was in this really interesting parenting debate that was hosted by Intelligence Squared, and I tell parents, you don't really bring up your child, they bring you up because they evoke certain kinds of treatments from you. And I also told the audience that parents of one child are usually environmentalists and parents of two are geneticists because the parents of the two children can see just how different the children are. And I really do think that differential individual treatment of each child is fair. I think equal treatment or similar treatment is unfair because it's not helping each child to develop their optimal capacities. You want to be sensitive to what the child wants, what the child is interested in, and also help the child get over certain difficulties the child may express.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I remember when Judith Rich Harris's book came out, The Nurture Assumption, the media went crazy saying, so you're saying that parents don't matter and that it doesn't make any difference how you treat your kid. It's like, no, what a crazy conclusion that is. Of course it matters. And I had a young daughter at the time, so my response to that was, well, I'm not doing these nice things for her or enriching things or whatever I'm doing for her so that she can get into Harvard and then when she's 30, she'll be different from the other. That's not why you do it. You do it because that's a loving thing to do that day, regardless of whatever the outcome can be that people like you would measure decades down the line. And I think people confuse that also, just kind of a scientific attempt to understand causality versus, why you treat somebody a certain way right now.
Sure. And parenting is a pleasurable activity. Parents get a lot of pleasure out of it. It's a difficult thing. It's difficult emotionally, it's difficult financially, but people do it because they love it and they get a lot of pleasure out of it. At least that's the immediate reward. So yeah.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Okay, let's get into the story. This is this New York City adoption agency. There's a lot of names and agencies. So just kind of walk us through the players. There's Viola Bernard and Peter Neubauer, and it's the Jewish Board of Guardians. That's now the Jewish Board of Family and Children's Services, and this was the Louise Wise Adoption Services. That was anyway. Just walk us through the players in this story, and then how it unfolded.
Yeah. Well, sure, Michael. Dr. Viola Bernard was a psychiatric consultant to Louise Wise Services. And this was an agency that serviced New York. They were known for being the preeminent agency that provided Jewish babies to Jewish families. Women, single Jewish women who were pregnant out of wedlock would relinquish these babies to the agency who then placed them. And Viola Bernard was of the opinion that twins were better off placed apart. Why? Because they would then develop better and more secure identities. So if they were to meet later on, their relationship would be much better. And she also worried about parental overburdening. And Peter Neubauer was the head of the Child Development Center at the Jewish Board of Guardians, now the Jewish Board of Family and Children's Services. And he and Bernard were close colleagues. And the conventional wisdom has always been that she was separating twins and he joined the study, or he had the idea for the study, or she had the idea for the study and he put it into practice. But as I have researched this, it's very hard to know which came first, the study or the theory. Did he have the idea and he was in search of a source? Or did she simply separate twins, realize the power of it, and solicited him? So it's very difficult to know. It's very difficult to know at this point which came first. But at any rate, twins had actually been separated prior to the 1960s when the study began. There was a pair of male-female twins separated in 47 and a pair of female twins separated in 52. And I suspect that since she was with that agency then, she had some hand in that. Well, they decided to study these twins, and they were studied several times during the first couple of years, and then a little bit less often, but still every year until each child turned 12. And initially, there were 5 identical pairs separated and the set of triplets for a total of 13 children. One of the pairs, as it turned out, was dropped from the study because they had a very different birth weight and they were placed in their adoptive homes at very different times. But, Michael, to eliminate a pair like that was bad science because these were not real scientists. These were all psychoanalytically oriented researchers. And so it was bad science to eliminate such a pair. We would never have done that. Now, Louise Wise tried to solicit other adoption agencies. They refused, citing what they called, or what Bernard called, the mystique of twinship. But to dismiss that so readily, I think, is unfair. Twinship is an important relationship. And to simply dismiss it as she did, I think, was extremely unfair. Anyway, the study progressed until the 1980s, early 80s. And if you remember, in 1980, those identical triplets, Bobby, David, and Eddie, met by chance with Bobby and Eddie meeting because Bobby was confused for Eddie at a small state college in New York State. And then when David saw the picture in the paper, he knew that he was the third member of that set. And that drew a lot of attention to that particular study. And Lawrence Wright, the journalist, did some research and figured out that these triplets were all tied to the Louise Wise services. Now, the study was shrouded in secrecy. I think they sensed at some level that it was not right. They got very upset when people outside their closed psychoanalytic circle heard about it. And I think that's why many of my colleagues didn't know about it. I heard about it in the 1980s when I joined the Minnesota study, because then 60 Minutes was poised to do an expose, which ultimately went nowhere for a number of reasons that I detail in the book, Deliberately Divided. By the way, he didn't give the title, Deliberately Divided. And so, but I did hear it over the years. And I mean, I was intrigued in the 80s. I was intrigued, fascinated, horrified. And I began to just sort of follow things from time to time. And then in 2004, I ran into one of the assistants, Dr. Larry Perlman, and he and I went to visit Dr. Neubauer before his death. He died in 2008. And Michael, he showed no remorse. He showed absolutely no remorse at what he had done. And in a book called Identical Strangers, was written by one of the pairs of twins, they pressed Neubauer and said, "Did you agree with Bernard's theory?" And he wouldn't really answer. He gave these non-answers. And finally he said, "Well, if I didn't agree with it, I wouldn't have gone ahead." But that's still a non-answer. That's skirting the issue. I think that he and Bernard saw this as an amazing opportunity to find the definitive answer to the nature-nurture question. After all, what excited them about the study? They were doing it in real time. They were following the twins, looking at the parenting styles as they unfolded over time, giving the twins lots of different ability, motor, and psychological tests. So there's a treasure trove of data that's been sealed at the Yale University archives, not to be opened until 2065. And I get into the ethics of this a great deal in one of the chapters. I've talked to ethicists, lawyers, people like that who are in a position to judge this sort of thing. And I was very careful, Michael, in this book to keep my opinion out of it, to present the facts as I saw them, and to save my judgments at the end, because I wanted people to come to their own conclusions. I also interviewed a lot of people who knew the Neubauers, who knew Neubauer and Bernard. Interestingly, many of them had never heard of the study. They never had because and that's not right. When people are involved in an exciting study, you wanna tell the world about it. You want feedback, you want suggestions. That's how scholarship works, and yet that was not the case here at all. He had opportunities. Twin congresses, the International Society for Twin Studies was just starting. Behavior genetics was in full swing. There were lots of twin research out there he could have consulted. Never did.
So just to put a fine point on it here, the ethical questions revolve around the fact that these infants were given up for adoption, and the parents were not told that they have a twin, or in this case, a triplet with the triplets. You mentioned the two that were separated, the two sets of twins in the 40s. Were those under the same conditions? The parents didn't know that they were adopting twins?
That's correct. The parents had absolutely no knowledge. One pair separated in 1947, the other in 1952. The parents were not told. And it's hard to know what guided that. It could have been the beginning of her thinking the twins were better off apart, or it could have been parental overburdening, or it could have been that they figured they could get more fees by four families as opposed to two families.
Mm.
That's a possibility. Uh,
Oh boy,
an
that
adoption
would be an
agency
ethical
suggested that,
question.
adoption agent worker suggested that to me. But what's interesting is that I said that in 47, it was a pair of male-female twins. Now, fraternal twins were not studied. They were not studied. They were simply separated. Why? They're not going to have the same identity issues that identicals could have by virtue of looking the same. And the pair that was separated in 52 is uncertain in terms of their twin type. They looked a lot alike. They look a little different. I can't quite classify them. But we know that beyond that, there were at least two other pairs, possibly three fraternals, known fraternals, who were separated and never studied. Why was that? Why was that? What was behind that if they were not studied? And Michael, many of these twins were kept together until they were 6 months old, even in the same crib. They were brought immediately to a foster care, and then they were sort of monitored there and then placed in their adoptive families. I mean, there is so much about this study, Michael, that just shocks me even now as we're talking about it. For example, in this one pair, Doug and Howard, they were kept together for 6 months, but during that 6 months, they were moved to many, many different foster situations. And so one of the observers said that each twin was the most stable object in the other one's environment. I mean, they were starting to interact. Babies do that, and twins often do it earlier than non-twins because they've got another kid right there. So, they babble and they touch each other and things like that. And they were separated. But why would you put twins together if you intend to separate them? It just does not make any sense. And many of the adoptive families would have gladly taken two babies, even requested twins. These were families who had a lot of money, were desperate for children. And they said, we would love to take twins. And yet they were told that, well, there are no twins. And the irony, Michael, these are twins who come into the world with a sibling. Louise Wise was very careful with the identicals to keep family circumstances the same across cases. So they purposely offered the baby to couples who had already adopted a child 2 to 3 years earlier. Now, why did they do that? They First of all, they figured the families knew what they were doing. But secondly, they didn't want the twin to grow up as an only child. And I'm thinking the twin's not an only child to begin with. It just did not make any sense. And the parents were never told that they were raising a twin child. Parents were told that one of the conditions of taking the child is that we're going to be making home visits to monitor the progress of children who are adopted. And in fact,
But
in
that was a
one
lie.
family, they were told, of course, it was a lie. And in another case, it turned out that the identical twin had an older sister who was 3 years older. And then there was a brother as well who was 3 years older than both of them. And uh, that family was told, we're studying adoption where there's three children in a family. See, so that was just made up. And there was never informed consent. I mean, the study had been going on for years, 18 years or so, when they decided to do informed consent in 1978. And as I've looked through comments by bioethicists, those I interviewed and those that I did not, a study does not become ethical once you get the informed consent after the fact. It's ethical to begin with, or it's not ethical, period.
So there's 2 documentary films on this: The Twinning Reaction and Three Identical Strangers. You were in the first one, and I think it was Neubauer who mentions that, or justifies or rationalizes that the literature says that it's better to separate the twins than not. And then they quote you saying, "There's no such literature. You couldn't find such a thing."
Actually, it was Viola Bernard who, in several places in her writings, said that the child development literature supports this. And Michael, there is no child development literature support this. I've looked, I've asked psychologists who were there at the time. There's nothing. People are aware of the unique situations twins pose. They always have been. Sometimes twins need a little more separation because they can develop private words and gestures. They need a little more separation, but you manage that. You manage that. But there was no child development literature at the time that supported that. Now, in 1986, one of their colleagues, Dr. Samuel Abrams, wrote a paper published in the Psychoanalytic Study of the Child. Again, the kind of publication that most of us don't see. And he referred to five specific studies that he said supported the case. I went back and read all those specific studies. What they are, 3 of them are case studies, 4 of them case studies of unusual, identical, and some fraternal twins, which are not representative of twins in general. And in one case, a well-known classic by Dorothy Burlingham, who worked with Anna Freud, they did close case studies of 3 pairs of identical twins at the Hampden nurseries in London. And in one of her last pages in the book, which, by the way, is also Xeroxed and underlined in Bernard's files. So she says she acknowledges that twins might have these issues, but parents can handle them, and everybody has issues. An older sibling, may have an issue with a younger sibling. Everybody has a certain little quirk in their family, but you don't start tearing families apart over it. You deal with it. And so she was never in favor of raising twins apart. Now, Burlingham made a very interesting observation in that little piece that she wrote. She said, some parents go to extremes and place twins apart. And I thought, who is she talking about? It made me wonder, did Burlingham know about this study? And I tried desperately to find out if she did know. Now, she was in touch with Anna Freud, who was a very close colleague of Peter Neubauer's. So she might have known and told Burlingham about it. Burlingham also placed a niece and a nephew in the Jewish Board of Guardians. And she knew Peter Neubauer well enough to get her niece and nephew in there. And they never knew about the twin study. But my point is that I think Burlingham may have been referring to this study when she wrote that particular line. I think it's possible.
Let's give them the benefit of the doubt for a moment and just play this out. It was, say, the 1950s, 1960s. So this is before the idea of informed consent and IRB boards that have to evaluate all research. I mean, this is kind of the era of guerrilla theater, social psychology, Milgram's shock experiments, and Zimbardo's faux prison experiment, and lying to subjects to get them to act a certain way, and then recording them through two-way mirrors, and on and on. I mean, that was that not kind of the culture of the time of how that kind of research was done?
Yes, it was the culture of the time. We did not have IRBs in place. That didn't come until the 1970s. We certainly had things like the Nuremberg codes from 47. We had the Helsinki Agreement in 64 and the Research Act in 74 and the Belmont in 76. But a lot of these came after the Louise Wise study was in place. Now, there was not the attention to informed consent at the time. Also, when it came to adoption, the understanding from the 20s till about the 50s was that these things should be private. You don't really reveal the identity of biological parents to adoptive parents and vice versa because you don't want interference and this and that. So that was kind of the culture of the times. Now, the separating twins, can we excuse that with reference to this culture of the times argument? Some people would say that we can. I think we cannot. And no one expresses it better than Dr. Mark Mercurio, a bioethicist at Yale, whom I interviewed. And he said just because something is legally okay, because it was, they were doing nothing illegal. Just because something is legally okay when there are no rules, it doesn't mean that that's okay to do it. There's a higher moral standing that you have to abide by, respect for individuals, the best interests of the children, all of that. And while Neubauer and Bernard may have thought they were acting in the best interest of the children, if they were hard pressed, how could they have admitted that? These were people who worked with children, who had very caring reputations, who were really venerated by their colleagues and by the public. And yet, it's hard for me to believe that they thought that what they were doing was really in the best interest of the children. And this, getting back to this culture of the times argument, I don't like it. Not just because of Mercurio, but because of what he says. It's, you can't just fall back on that and say, well, should we say that about Nazi officers? Why are we still prosecuting Nazi officers when we see them? After all, it was the culture of the times. They could do what they wanted. Why are we going back to politicians and penalizing them for blackface? They did it when they were teenagers, young adults. It happened then. People did it. Why are we bothering with that? And sexual harassers, we're going after them too because what they did was not right. And that was very much a culture of the times type of thing. So that to me carries no weight whatsoever, even though many people will invoke that. It's an explanation, it's not an excuse.
Yeah, the fact that Neubauer had to lie, well, and the Louise Wise Institute to the parents. I mean, they had to know. Well, we're lying, so and we don't want them to find out what we did. They had to know on some level this is really not the right thing to do, but we want to do it anyway for science or whatever.
There's a big section in there, Michael, where I talk about all the meetings that they had. You see, the the Viola Bernard archives at Columbia have a lot of information that is publicly available, and the rest of it was opened in 2021. I wasn't able to get down there because of COVID, but I got a lot of stuff that I don't think anyone's ever seen. It's just fascinating. And there were a lot of meetings where they brought in outside experts to discuss a lot of this. They were worried about lawsuits and insurance. That's what they were worried about. They weren't so afraid of the twins finding out, only to the extent that there would be lawsuits against them. And in fact, somebody said, well, there's nothing in this protocol that says you have to tell the twins. And Viola Bernard kind of was happy about it. She wrote this little happy message in the margin of the page. I mean, it's just, it's hard to believe. And, with Peter Neubauer, I mean, he was a respected guy and he did so much for children and one child families and child language. He did so many good things. And he was in a position, I believe, to have said to Viola Bernard, what you're doing is not right. Let's stop it. But he didn't. And to me, he is complicit. Whether he agreed with her theory or not, I think he's complicit, tacitly so. He went ahead. And this is not, Michael, this is not something that just was a spur of the moment decision and people say, oh my God, I made a mistake. This went on for years. This went on for years. It was orchestrated, well thought out, planned. Lots you can say about that.
Yeah, no, I agree. And then on your side of that ledger, I would put I'm so surprised that a Jewish organization after the Holocaust would think, yeah, let's do what Mengele did. I mean, weren't they thinking, this is really the kind of the wrong thing to do. This is what they did to our people. So I'm doubly amazed that they engaged in this.
Well, yeah, I am too. Viola Bernard actually helped some prominent people escape the Holocaust, and she put them up in her house in Nyack. And Peter Neubauer grew up in a small town in Vienna, and he had to leave, as did the rest of his family. They went to Palestine. He went to Switzerland to complete his medical studies there and then came to New York City. So he understood what this was all about, and yet he's still engaged in it, which makes it even more difficult to understand. Now, some of the twins, some of the parents have called it Nazi science, Nazi shit. I believe that the Triplets called it that in their film, Three Identical Strangers. And I do have a section where I address whether or not it is Nazi shit. And I would say that, look, it's not quite the same. After all, the twins were in very loving homes. They weren't abused in any way. But still, their lives were manipulated in ways that never should have happened. And you've got to think about it from the point of view of the twins. And honestly, Michael, if I were a twin, I'm a Jewish twin. If I had been one of those separated ones from New I might have called it Nazi shit too. But I think the parallels are really unfair. There are some similarities, but it's not an exact analogy, not at all.
Yeah, there's that scene in one of the docs where some of the twins and parents met with that Jewish board, the guardians or whoever they are, and that and it looked like they had placated them, and they all left, and it was pouring rain, and one of them left their umbrella in the building, so he went back in and saw them toasting each other with champagne, like they dodged a bullet. We bullshitted the parents and the twins. We got away with it. It was the sense that this person had.
Yeah. Yeah, I remember that scene. It was very effective. That movie does the most wonderful reenactment of so many scenes. It's just worth seeing if you've not seen it yet. I know you have, but I'm sure many of your readers have, your listeners have not. And I spoke to the stepdaughter of the former executive director. The former executive director was Florence Creech Brown, and she probably would have been among that group. And what's so fascinating is that her stepdaughter, who became her stepdaughter when she was 17, knew nothing about this study. And Paula worked in social work, so it was a related field. Her stepmother never mentioned this. And the only reason she saw the movie was because she knew that her stepmother had been involved with Louise Wise. She was shocked by what she saw. So there's another example of how people just didn't discuss this publicly. They just didn't. Outside of their closed circles, they never discussed this publicly. And that's a message. And I'll tell you, Michael, this book was a lot different to write than the other ones because in my other 6 books, people can't wait to talk about twins. When I would ask for an interview, people were just ready to talk to me for hours. But here, people would say, I don't want to talk. If I do, it's anonymous. Some people never even answered me after 2 or 3 attempts. And at first, I was really miffed by it. But then I realized that's information. The fact that they don't want to talk, that's interesting information. And I really make that point in the book.
Right. So they know there was something wrong there. So the lack of information is information about their ethical awareness of what they were involved in.
And I think this raises a very important point. The idea that graduate students, postdocs have mentors who are highly thought of in the field and who have a lot of influence over their mentees' future careers. And so, to what extent are grad students put in this difficult position of carrying out the requests of their advisor, even if they don't feel it's quite correct? And some of them did that. One of the women told me, and she spoke anonymously, one of the assistants told me that she felt so awful because she would go to one home one day and see this twin, and then she'd go to the twins' home, the co-twins' home another day, and see the exact same child with maybe a different accent because they were New Jersey, Long Island, different parts of New York City. And she said, I knew what the parents did not know. And she said, all her life, she was so troubled by this. She told nobody but her husband. She was so troubled by this. And I suspect that some of the others probably were as well.
So, right, that example, she must have known, I know this is wrong, and this is my job, so I got to do it, but I know this is wrong. Well, and then there's the one researcher who, the graduate student who was hoping to get a PhD out of it, who was there for a year doing it, and then realized this is such a mess. It's so unscientific, chaos, I think he called it, just totally unorganized. I'm never going to get a doctoral dissertation out of this, so he left. And he appears in both of those films. And I think I forget his name, but I know you know him and talk to him.
Larry Perlman.
So what's his name again?
Dr. Larry Perlman. He's now at the University of
Yeah.
Michigan.
Yeah. So what's his story? He understood there was something wrong here.
Well, his story, no. Actually, he did years later. But what happened, the reason I got in touch with him, well, first of all, he worked on the study for 10 months, hoping to get a doctoral dissertation. And of course, it didn't happen, so he left. He didn't have a great deal of contact with Neubauer, even though Neubauer had hired him. But he said that the research was not well done, that there was really nothing he could salvage from it. So Dr. Bouchard, who was my postdoctoral mentor, was at a conference or a seminar at the University of Michigan where he ran into Larry Perlman and then put the two of us together. And so we went together to see Peter Neubauer in 2004, 2005. And he and I actually wrote these companion pieces published in the Twin Research in Human Genetics. And in his particular piece, he wrote that he really hadn't thought about the ethics of this at the time. It was only after I spoke to him that he began to think about it and realize that this was not right. I don't think a lot of people thought about it, and they might have thought, even if they thought about it fleetingly, Michael, they might have said, well, if Bernard and Neubauer think it's okay, then it's probably okay. A lot of people reason that way. They do. But my understanding is that there were people at Louise Wise, people hired by the Jewish board to carry out the assessments, were just not comfortable with this.
Right. So almost kind of an obedience to authority, I suppose. Well, the boss says it's okay, so I guess it's okay. Something like that, maybe a post rationalization. The triplets case is so interesting. So let me just get their names right there. The triplets are Bob, Dave, and Eddie. And that film opens with, I think it was Bob who went to that community college and he'd never been there before. And everybody's greeting him like, he's their long lost friend. And he got kissed on the lips by some woman. And guys are slapping him on the back. Good to see you again. He's like, what the fuck is going on here? And it's such a great way that got discovered. So the first part of that story, and I vaguely remember seeing some media coverage of them because they were huge in the 80s. I think it was like the Today Show, and there was a bunch of different shows about them. But it was done more as an entertaining story. Like, look at these three guys. They look the same, raised in different homes. They dress the same, and they laugh the same, and all the similarities. But I had no idea what was behind any of that. I suppose nobody did at the time. But then the story turns tragic when I guess it's Eddie who commits suicide, and then it shifts to they all had kind of a dark personality, and then the kind of the hint in the film is that it was due to their separation, although that's not at all clear to me from a scientific perspective, because they could all inherit the same propensity to have high anxiety or suicidal ideation or whatever. So how do you think about what we can learn from those triplets?
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good question. We know that all the triplets had inherited some predisposition toward psychiatric symptoms. Their mother, their birth mother, who they met, was an alcoholic, and she had some psychopathology. So all three had the predisposition. Now, why Eddie and not the other two? I have some ideas about that. The film makes a big point that Eddie was raised in a home where he never felt quite comfortable, that his father was a strict disciplinarian. They were not very closely connected, and he thinks that might have been part of it. I think that's the least important part of it. I think the most important part of it was that he really suffered when Bobby walked out of the restaurant. Bobby left the restaurant at one point because these triplets, they owned a restaurant called Triplets in Soho, but they never had a shared social history. And so they didn't learn how to negotiate difficulties the way siblings raised together do. So that was one issue. And then also, David's father, who they nicknamed Bubba, was a very warm, effusive guy. And he kind of took the three of them under his wing, called them all my three sons. And so Eddie was getting the attention and warmth and sense of belonging that he never had all his life. So when Bobola passed away, I think Eddie took it a little harder than the other two. Now, Bobby was raised in a very loving home. His father was often absent. His father was a doctor, but it was a much more affluent home. But he was given a much stronger psychological grounding, as was David. David raised with that wonderful, loving father. So Eddie was a little bit short, short drifted there, I think. But it's a whole confluence of things. It's not just the home rearing. It's in conjunction with the events that happened. And it could be that, identical twins and triplets are not exactly alike genetically. It could be that Eddie got a somewhat higher loading of whatever psychiatric predisposition that the twins and triplets had all inherited. So it's possible there too.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you
Now,
about that.
as Bobby said in
Epigenet.
one of the films, as Bobby said in one of the films, why Eddie and why not me? Question you could ponder forever.
Right. Well, but pondering is one thing. Studying it is what you do. So let's think about that for a minute. They're not identical twins are not really perfectly identical. There are slight differences in vitro, right? Who's on top and who's below in the womb, and different maternal hormone doses, and even genetics. Aren't there slight like epigenetic differences, and some genes turn on and off depending on the environment, including the environment in the womb? So just sort of talk about what identical actually means.
Yeah, well, identical means that you form from the same fertilized egg, but between the time that the split happens, which is very early, within the first 2 weeks after conception, until the baby is born at 8 or 9 months, there's a lot of development going on there. There can be different distribution of cells, for example. There can be point mutations, both before and after birth, in fact. And then there can be genes that turn on or turn off, the whole science of epigenetics. So there's a lot of difference going on that can potentially make an impact. And maybe some of that is what explains Eddie's suicide and the non suicides of the other two. But I will say that despite all of this, Michael, we're still so impressed with how identical twins are so alike. I mean, they are still so alike in so many ways, despite these tendencies to try to make them different. And they're more alike than any other pair of people, even down to the choice of the unusual toothpaste. So, we need to find out exactly what is the impact of some of these things. What's very interesting is that there have been cases of women who have had intercourse with two different identical twins and then became pregnant. So you ask yourself, who's the father? And actually, custody decisions have been held up in these cases because you can't assign who the father is. And of course, both twins are denying it. But now, with our
Okay.
epigenetic tools, with our ability to identify point mutations, this technology will be able to assist in those cases.
Oh, wow. Right. But there was another twin pair of girls, one of whom, in this study, one of whom found her other twin who had already committed suicide. So it was like another
They
suicide.
were fraternal, Michael. They were fraternal.
Oh, fraternal. Oh,
Yeah,
okay.
there were
All right.
3. They were fraternal. There were 3 suicides. There was Eddie's, there was this twin you mentioned, but she was fraternal, and she didn't know about her twinship or find the twin's family for 11 years after her twin had suicided. And then there was another case, the one mentioned in 1952, the ones who were not in the study, one of them committed suicide as well, or at least it's alleged that she did, and it's very likely that she did. So what I think that gets back to the idea that you have to think about who are the women in those years who gave up children for adoption. And these were young women, maybe sexually impulsive, unrestrained, and they probably was some psychopathology in those families. And you know, I was able to get some of the background information on some of the mothers, and there were quite a few who had undergone psychiatric hospitalizations. And so it's not a surprise that you would have some of these symptoms developing in some of the twins.
Did we go even one level higher? I was thinking about this reading your book, although I have no idea and I didn't have time to look it up. Wasn't there studies about Ashkenazi Jews had higher rates of anxiety and depression? They scored higher on the neuroticism level of the Big Five and so on because of certain levels of inbreeding over centuries. And I have no idea if any of the adoptees from this adoption center are from that population or if this is not even relevant.
I think that all of those twins were from the Ashkenazi population. I'm confident that they all were. And of course, not all the fathers were, but all the mothers were. And I have seen some studies. I'm not, an expert in that literature, but I've seen some where Ashkenazi Jews do seem to score higher in anxiety. But whether that translates into psychiatric symptoms, of course, we don't know. We'd have to look more carefully at that.
Right. So you have chapters on Anne and Susan, Melanie and Ellen, Howard and Doug, Paula and Elise, Paula and Marjorie, and Michelle and Allison. You want to kind of give us a quick overview of, in addition to the famous triplets, what are some of the other findings?
Yeah, well, I'll talk about some of them. So Anne and Susan were dancers, it turns out. They were separated just like the other ones were. And it turned out that through their lives, they were dancers. One of them started very early in life, one of them started a little bit later. And their coming together was not as easy as Viola Bernard would have anticipated because one twin was much further along in dance than the other one was. And so the one who was not as far along didn't get into a certain program and felt kind of miffed by it and felt that if they'd grown up together, that they could have been double dancers. I mean, they looked exactly the same. That's a whole opportunity that they were denied. So it may sound trivial, but it was a manipulation that did not have to happen. But they're very good friends now. They were wonderful to interview. Interestingly, they both married German husbands and divorced them. Whether they were attracted to the same type of person, I thought was quite interesting. And they both had a nervous habit of kind of taking their necklace and twirling it around like that. That was something that somebody observed. Interestingly, that pair met by chance when they were 6 or 7. They didn't actually meet, but the parents went to a home. The parents of one twin went to a home, and some people recognized her as their childhood friend and said, "What are you doing here?" And it was all very confusing. But the point is that each parent went back to Viola Bernard. Bernard said, "Do not tell do not tell the children." So these parents, Michael, were put in a position where they knew they were raising a twin and did not tell their child. The twins met by chance at 17 when somebody confused them. And you can imagine how that really played havoc with family dynamics. You're keeping a secret from me that I'm a twin. You kept the secret all my life. That did not play out well in one case. But they're wonderful friends now, and I can't wait to meet them. I'm going to meet them in New York in the spring. I've done everything on Zoom and by telephone. The next pair was Melanie and Ellen, and they met by chance when Ellen's aunt went to an IHOP's restaurant far from her house, didn't even want to go, but her friend wanted to, and saw the hostess looked exactly like her niece. And a couple of questions here and there revealed the whole truth. And the parents went to see Viola Bernard. And yes, they admitted that these were twins separated at birth, but were never told there was a study. Was never told there was a twin study. See? And so the truth was not always conveyed. These twins also had some bumps along the way in their relationship, but they get along beautifully now. And I've actually met them a couple of times. They are delightful women. And when I met them for the first time, I took each one out to a restaurant and they both picked Greek. So I thought that was kind of interesting. I mean, these twins too are typical of others. They have a lot of similarities. Both of those twins go to the bathroom frequently because they have small bladders, and they both dislike seafood, and they both wash their hands incessantly after touching red meat. So they have a lot of these kind of sensitive sorts of issues, sensitivity to environmental types of things. And let's see, Doug and Howard, who were in both of the films, uh, they met sometime, I believe, in their 30s. And they met because one of the twins was actually told that he was a twin. He was told by a Louise Wise social worker who was not sanctioned to give that information, but she was dying of cancer and felt that it's the least she could do before her death. And of course, he was shocked and really, it was hard to find the twin, but eventually they did. And the parents were furious, absolutely furious about this, because they said that one of the couples was on one of the documentaries and said that their child just kind of closed down and shut down at some point, and they had a sense he was missing something, but what it was, they never quite figured out. It's hard to say. Were they missing a twin? Were they missing a biological connection? It's really hard to know. Um, I've really left that as an open question because there's really no prenatal knowledge of twinship. And the Minnesota twins I interviewed when I was a postdoc there are all adoptees mostly, and they sort of felt an inner emptiness, as many adoptees do, but it didn't specifically have to do with the twin. Once they found the twin, they felt that this missing piece had been filled. Let's see. I'm going to take a look at my book too because it's hard to remember who all of the twins are, and I've got it
Oh
right
yeah,
here.
no, I know. There's
Um,
well, let me
yeah,
just. It's okay
yeah.
while you're looking that
So,
up. Let me just riff on that for a minute. So something like
yeah.
attracted to German men. Okay, I kind of get that. Why would they be more likely to get divorced? Well, let's say maybe you're more difficult to live with. Maybe you're high on the neuroticism scale. You're anxious, or you're mean, or you're grumpy a lot of the time, and your spouse just gets tired of it, and it leads to conflict in a marriage. So that increases the probability of you getting divorced. And identical twins, of course, share those personality temperaments. So that would be something like the genetics of divorce.
Yeah, well, there are twin studies, many of them, in fact, that talk about genetic influences on divorce, and it comes down to mostly difficult personalities. And the thing is that there's no divorce gene. You make the decision to divorce or not. It's completely in your control. So I just want to make that point. I think it's an
Yeah, of
important one.
course.
The next pair I want to, yeah, the next pair I want to talk about, we've talked about the triplets, is Sharon. Um, Sharon Morello is a wonderful woman who found out about her twin through Lori Shinseki, who was the director and producer of The Twinning Reaction, the film. And she called Sharon's mother to tell her. Sharon's mother told Sharon, and Sharon just was in total disbelief about it. And it came at a time when Sharon had undergone breast surgery for cancer. and she felt that maybe this is something that she should tell her twin because after all, they share their genes. And so they met. They met at a restaurant midway between the two homes, and the women got along brilliantly. I mean, the husbands who I talked to said that it was just one thing after another. One similarity, as if they'd known each other all their lives. They'd named their sons the same name, both Joshua, because they liked the name. Things like that. Many, many similarities in terms of food preferences and things like that. Ultimately, that relationship dissolved for various reasons that I go into in the book. And Sharon feels that as the sort of the lone twin, she's not on a par with some of the others, but she's a wonderful woman, and I've met her, and I just can't say enough wonderful things about her. Um,
So let me ask you
I'm
about
going to talk about some of the twins. Go
yeah, go
ahead.
ahead. Well, I was going to ask you
About what?
about the twinning
Oh, I was
reaction,
going to say.
what that word means, something
Oh,
about how the twins
yeah, yeah, yeah.
themselves are attached in the womb. This reminded me
Right.
of
Oh,
Bowlby's attachment theory. Is another ethical issue with separating twins, that there is such a thing as attachment theory. It really does matter, and not just attachment of children to their parents, but in this case, siblings and twins that are the same age in the crib. They are forming attachments. Is that what the twinning
mhm.
reaction means?
Yes. Viola Bernard. Well, first of all, the twinning reaction does not apply only to twins. It applies to a lot of things, close in age siblings or parents and children or whatever. Now, Viola Bernard said, and she said this in written documents that I've reviewed, that if twins develop the so-called twinning reaction, which meant interaction, awareness of the other one, they were not separated. But I don't believe that, Michael, and I'll tell you why. I don't believe it because there was that one pair where several pairs where it was documented and they were still separated. Also, um, I don't believe it because where are the fraternal twins who were separate, who were put together? Now, she said if twins develop this, they were put together. Where are the twins who were put together? We have never heard of them. And I mean, there had to have been some out there who were put together, if in fact some were put out together. Where are they? We've never heard anything from them. So that's what the twinning reaction was. She put it out there. I don't believe she followed it. I don't believe she followed it because, as I said, where are the twins? So that so now that was the title of the earlier documentary by Lori Shinseki that came out in 2017. That's where that comes from. Now, the other pair I want to talk about has gotten less attention. Some of the pairs have gotten more attention, but some less. And I want to talk about Paula and Marjorie. They were a fraternal pair. And Paula was the one who found her sister Marjorie 11 years after Marjorie had passed away from suicide. The Louise Wise adoption agency did not know that. So when Paula was about 39 or 40, she went to Louise Wise to just get information about her biological family. She had four sons. They were into family planning or would be at some stage. And she wanted to be able to help them in this way. And that's when she was told she was a twin. So she contacted Louise Wise and they contacted Marjorie's mother. And Marjorie's mother was just floored because 11 years after your daughter's suicide, someone's asking on the phone to speak to Marjorie. It's a little bit unsettling. Anyway, Paula was a lovely, lovely woman, and she got along beautifully with the family of Marjorie, although it was very difficult for her to maintain a relationship with Marjorie's mother because she was this reminder. They looked alike, but they were clearly fraternal. They looked alike enough that she was a real reminder. But she was very, very emotional about not having met her twin, emotional about having been separated. And Marjorie was one of the twins who suicided. And Paula couldn't help but feel that if we'd been together, maybe I could have helped her. It's possible. There's strength in numbers. Maybe she could have helped her. And there's a wonderful scene in the twinning reaction where Paula goes to Marjorie's grave and stands there and looks at it and describes her feelings. It's just very, very moving. I was helped a lot in that chapter by Paula's wonderful husband, Adam. He was just marvelous, and I'm going to be meeting a lot of them again in New York City in June. I'm excited about that. It's one of the more poignant stories, I think. And another one I want to mention is Michelle and Allison. Oh, I should also point out that Paula sadly passed away in her sleep a couple of years ago, just after the film was made. brain aneurysm. I talk about that in the book. And, when Paula went to see her adoptive mother, who she tracked down to Las Vegas, her mother, Hedda, never knew the girls were separated. She was she was adamant about them keeping the twins together, and they were still separated. So it's not true that this was done always with the adoptive mother's or the biological mother's consent, as the agency lets us think. In Michelle and Allison's case, Tim Wardle, who directed Three Identical Strangers, produced this wonderful 8-minute documentary called Two Identical Strangers. And it turned out that when Michelle heard about the movie and she realized that she was a 1960s Louise Wise adoptee, she thought, just maybe. So she put her DNA into one of the DNA data banks, and they came up with a match, her sister Allison. And of course, neither one knew that they were a twin. They were fraternal twins. It's a beautiful picture of them in the book, and they got along beautifully. Tim filmed them. It's a moving, wonderful little video. And what struck me about the video is how physically comfortable they felt with each other. There was a lot of hugging and arm touching and this sort of thing. And when they met at a hotel later on, they got together several times. They stayed in the same bed together, and you don't just do that with a stranger. But they weren't strangers; they knew each other. Anyway, they formed this wonderfully close relationship. I've met both of them, never together, but individually. And then, so sadly, Michael, Michelle became ill with pancreatic cancer about a year ago, and she passed away just this last June. So the twins only had not even 3 years together, and it just it changed. Having the twinship changed their lives because they both acquired nieces and nephews and in-laws and all kinds of people. And Allison is still maintaining that, which is wonderful. But this is what Neubauer and Bernard deprived the twins of. I mean, so much richness in their lives. And I'll just mention one other case of Justin and Julie. Uh, Justin was not a twin, as it turned out, but he was a 1960s Louisa Watts adoptee. And when his daughter saw his look-alike at a restaurant, she took a picture of him, which I have in the book, and the two of them look amazingly similar. And of course, having a look-alike, many people say, well, everyone has one. When you're a Louise Wise 1960s adoptee, it carries a much greater meaning. And it turned out he found his birth mother. He was not a twin. But nevertheless, he took me on a fascinating ride through all of that. And I have all that in the book.
This is also tragic, made all the worse by the fact that none of this was published. Many of the twins told you, well, okay, this horrible thing happened, but at least can we find out what you learned? No. Astonishing. And then they have that clip from Lawrence Wright's interview with Neubauer, in which he says, well, you could tell he was bullshitting. I'm about to publish. We're going to come out with this in about a year and a half. You could just tell in his voice he was bullshitting. It was never going to be published.
Oh, sure.
Because by then, it was clear that what they did was wrong. So if he published it, he'd probably be in big trouble. And now it's locked away.
Michael, I just the data were locked away, even as Peter Neubauer was saying we're going to publish in a year and a half. But I will say that I have 2 chapters that talk about publications and one contract they had with the Yale University Press for a book. And you'll see in the first chapter on publications that there were a couple of case studies that were done, a lot of repetition. One even refers to matched samplings, never to twins. But you can see that these were probably twins. I can't prove it, but they probably were. The word matched samplings doesn't make any sense in that article whatsoever. And then the book contract, they were supposed to have one. It eventually never came to pass, and I think it was because they didn't have the informed consents. So a book was published by a different publisher in 1990 called Nature's Thumbprint. And to anyone who knows twins well, there were excerpts about reared-apart twins here and there. And a lot of those excerpts are not cited, but they're not from his case. They're from previous reared-apart twin cases. They were very careful to not mention Louise Wise. Viola Bernard shows up nowhere in that book. Louise Wise isn't mentioned. I mean, even in 1990, they were concealing details. And so it's very, very troubling. And some of the fathers were saying, at least publish something, but there was nothing. I have to say, though, that if we were to get a hold of the data that had been sequestered at the Yale archives, I'm not sure it would tell us anything new that we didn't know already. I just can't believe that there is anything that we can't retrieve with our much better models and better samples and better analytic tools.
Oh, I see. So the data, this would be like retrieving Nazi data on smoking. Well, we already know what the effects of smoking are. We don't need their data. That's your point.
That's my point exactly. That it might be just of historical interest, but to publish it, I think would send the wrong message to future investigators. Now, I've written to the Jewish Board of Family Child Services. They ultimately were the ones who deposited the material at Yale. I don't know who made that decision, and I've tried asking a million people, and nobody says that they did it. Nobody knows. It's one of those things. But at any rate, I've tried. They make the point in several places that researchers can gain access if they write. I've written twice. I've been refused both times. No one's going to get it until 2065 when anybody can look at it. And that's what's really puzzling and painful because some twins have gotten some material, but not all. And it's a very arduous process they're put through, which I think is just shameful. These are adults who can make informed decisions about what they want to see, what they can't see. And I think it's shameful that they're not just given access. Who owns these data? What is Yale holding it for? I think, as somebody pointed out in an article, Yale's afraid that other prominent donors will hesitate to put material in Yale if they think that stuff will be disclosed. Now, Yale has no power to disclose it. It's only the Jewish Board of Family and Children's Services that does. But I think that they're really making too much of this by not doing it. If they just simply gave it to the twins, then the secrecy is broken and everybody will go home and go away and they could apologize, although no one there is responsible. Nobody there had a hand in this. So I still don't understand why this stuff is still so shrouded in secrecy. I just don't get it.
Yeah. So what are the legal aspects of this? Why couldn't some of the twins just hire a law firm and just file a lawsuit against Yale and say, you give us our paper or we're going to sue you?
Well, some of the twins have, and some lawyers are working with some of the twins on a pro bono basis. And of course, the Jewish board has hired their own set of lawyers and they've set out certain conditions. So, as I said, Yale really does not have the authority to release it. They just don't because they've signed certain papers with the donors, and the year is 2065 when it can be released. But it can be released to the twins with redaction, and redacting material is done to take out the names of other people, right, who might be on that page. And some twins have said that the whole paper is just these black lines that come out. But it's still an arduous process. I've seen some of it. I have talked about it in the book, and people will see certain things. I also, in Viola Bernard's archives at Columbia, there was actually some data charts, and there were, um, what would you call it? A, a book proposal, part of a book proposal and chapter, and I've reprinted a lot of that. So there's a
Yeah, I
lot of
saw
things
that.
that people will
It was
see.
amazing.
Now,
You were able to
one
get
one
that
of the
stuff.
I know, but it was public. I mean, I didn't try to get it. I tried, but it was there. And one thing I wanted to mention too is that in the archives, you can get a listing of what's in there at Yale. So in the listings, there is reference to a manuscript. And this was also mentioned in a Journal of the American Medical Association letter that came out a couple of years ago, authored by Hoffman and Oppenheim, two colleagues of Neubauer's. And so there's reference to this 200-page manuscript. Where is it? Who's seen it? You know, what made me laugh was that in that JAMA letter, they kind of uh, bemoaned the fact that, or an accused Wardle of not checking the literature and said, look, there's a 200-page manuscript. Well, how's he going to see it if it's stuck at Yale? I mean, you can't, right? If it's sequestered. So it was really not quite it was not quite a fair accusation.
Well, the
But yeah,
2065
where is this
date,
manuscript?
yeah, the 2065 date seems designed to make sure everybody's dead that could be associated with this in any way.
Right,
And that, of course, makes
right,
people
exactly.
suspicious. I'm suspicious. Of course. What are you hiding?
Exactly. See, this is the point. When you shroud this in secrecy, you have to wonder what is in there. What is in there that is so terrible that they're hiding? I mean, some of the twins said that when their mothers were interviewed, and mothers weren't always interviewed, but they were on occasion. And one write up was, they have a messy house. That's what they wrote. And the mother said, look, I'm raising two or three children. Everyone has a messy house. What is the point of that?
Right. Well, I guess the researchers are probably just writing down everything they can think of. And as you point out, it wasn't a very rigorous research protocol in any case. So they probably didn't even know what they should be asking. They probably just wrote down everything.
Yeah.
I suppose it would be something like the environment is messy versus ordered, and messiness versus order has some influence on personality, something like that.
Yeah. Well, because they brought the psychoanalytic perspective to it. Something I want to come back to that I think is important is the following. You know, I told you about Viola Bernard's theory about how twins are better off being raised apart. Well, then if she believed so ardently in this reasoning, why didn't she convey it to child development organizations and parenting groups? Did it apply only to a minority of twins given up for adoption? If this was really so serious, she should have written about it widely. She should have gone to speak publicly about it, and yet she did never took up opportunities when she had them. Now, you can say, well, how would a mother give up one or both twins? Well, just to play at devil's advocate, mothers and fathers make sacrifices to their kids all the time. And if you were to convince a parent that this is in your child's best interest, then maybe some mothers would, but no mother would really. And Viola Bernard never pushed that. And she, in fact, even had nieces or great nieces who are identical twins. And that I spoke to the mother of those twins. The idea of separation was never raised. Never.
Yeah, this just sounds like a rationalization for doing something you know you shouldn't be doing.
Yeah, I would think so.
So what's the follow up on this? What more can we learn until 2065?
Well, I think we can learn more as the twins go more public. I think certainly this book is going to convey a lot of information that no one has ever seen before. I think that some of the take home lessons are the sanctity of the family and also how to do research. I think, as I said in the last line of the book, this is a great example of how not to do research. And I think that we have to think about legality versus ethics. And just because something is legal does not make it right. I don't think you can fall back on that as an excuse. And I think the culture of the times argument does not apply here or to the other examples that I mentioned. So it could be that the twins will talk more about their situations as they learn more about the kind of data collected from them. Uh, it could be that some of them will be more successful getting the data, and if that's the case, I'd be willing to take a look at it, but I would only write it up with enormous caveats, saying that this should never have been done, that sort of thing. But that's speculative down the line. So I think that it really it shows us the excitement that people can have, the scientists can have over potentially useful project, but they were blindsided to what they were doing. And it shows us that the prominent people who intend to do good often do very bad. And it calls into question how we judge them. What are you willing to live with? We're taking down statues around the United States and renaming buildings and things like that. And you have to ask yourself, do we honor Peter Neubauer? Do we not for what the work he did? Or do we dismiss him totally because of the twin research? Viola Bernard Foundation, established after her death, established a fellowship at Yale named the Viola W. Bernard Fellowship. And so, do we keep that name? Do we not? How do we think about those things? And I think it's hard to get a hold on that because people have different opinions. For me, as a twin researcher, I would never name a building, a fellowship, anything after either one of them. I just could not do that in good faith. But I know that not everybody agrees with me. But those are hard, very hard decisions to make because they will not just not please everybody.
Well, because some people are thinking, well, it's not fair to judge people of the past by modern standards. But you've already made the point that, in fact, they knew this was the wrong thing to do, or else why would they act the way that they did? So I think that's pretty well established. It seems that the ethical issue seems pretty clear to me from your book.
I think it's very clear. And even adoption workers that I interviewed who were around at the time were horrified by this, absolutely horrified by this. And they represent the thinking at the time. I purposely wanted to get people from that time because I knew that they would have the right perspective on this.
It also seems like the twins should know because there might be some medical issues because so much physical attributes were measured, and that could have, who knows, implications for as they get older, what diseases they may have or whatever.
Oh, absolutely, Michael. That's an excellent point. And in fact, that reminds me to tell your listeners about one very specific event that happened. There were identical twin girls raised apart, and they both developed convulsions at the same time. And their respective physicians treated them and evaluated them differently. Even that did not persuade the researchers to bring the families together, let the physicians consult each other. What's in the best interest of these children? But they were treated differently. And maybe one child was helped, one child wasn't, maybe neither was helped. But that to me is just unthinkable. And if you consider also that identical twins are ideal organ donors for one another, let's suppose that one needed an organ, that person existed and they would have been deprived of that. And some fraternal twins are good for that as well, not as good as identicals, but nevertheless, it's a source. And remember, these were raised by adoptive families. So that was a whole area that they never even thought about. And we know that based on the twin report on kidney transplants that was famous by Murray, that was out there by then. It was the first successful kidney transplant that involved identical twins. And one of them, the one who got the transplant, lived for years. So Bernard and Newbarrow had to have been aware of that, but it never entered their thinking. Never.
Interesting. Wow, Nancy, this is your deepest, most important book to date. What's the follow up to this? What's next on your research and meeting with twins projects?
Actually, Michael, I'm about to sign another contract. I
Oh,
must be a glutton for punishment, but I'm gonna talk about in great detail a very interesting case that cuts across twinship, immigration law, and gay marriage. It was a case that got quite a bit of national attention some time ago. A young man from the U.S. went to Israel to work on a kibbutz, and he met and fell in love with another gentleman there. The two of them were married in Canada in 2010, and they donated their sperm to a sperm donor, a Canadian woman, and she bore twins for them, and they each fathered one twin. So it's kind of like what we talked about earlier, where a woman can have these half sibling twins. So that's what happened there. Now, they're a loving, beautiful family, and they had two beautiful little boys. And then when they tried to come to the US to live in Los Angeles, Canadian customs raised all kinds of terrible questions about who's the parent and this and that, something you never would have done with a heterosexual couple. And the fathers wanted to keep it quiet. They didn't want this broadcast all over the place. But at any rate, one child had a Canadian mother and an American father, but the other had a Canadian mother and an Israeli father. So they would not give citizenship to that twin. So the twins were about to be separated, which was horrendous. So the couple did come to LA, but they got involved with immigration equality in New York and lawyers and all this. And over the years, there were settlements and then appeals. This went up to, I mean, Rex Tillerson was named as one of the uh, people on the case, and Mike Pompeo. I mean, this went to high places, and it just
wow.
settled last May. So I was dying to get a hold of this case, but I had to wait until everything settled for good, that I could talk to lawyers and the Canadian surrogate, everybody else. So I'll be meeting them in the next couple of months for sure. We've done some Zooms. That's my next project. And then after that, I'm hoping to publish an annotated photography book. And in 1985, when the Mengele twins reunited for the first time, they all came together to celebrate the 40th anniversary reunion or 40th anniversary liberation of Auschwitz at a ceremony at Auschwitz, and then later a public hearing on Mengele's war crimes at Yad Vashem. I was at both of those, the only psychologist in the world to go to those. And I took 100 spectacular pictures that I've done nothing with. And so during the pandemic, when I was home, I looked through them and, Michael, this is stuff that should be published. And so I'm trying to get a contract. I'm very close to getting one now, but that's something that I definitely want to do I might even do it at the same time as the immigration twins. I'll have to see.
Let me see if I followed that thread with the gay couple. They each made a sperm
Sure.
donation, and the surrogate mother. It was one surrogate mother that had two eggs.
It
And
was
so
one
they're
surrogate mother. She gestated she gestated the children at the same time. So what happened was they took 2 eggs from her and they fertilized them with sperm from each father. And the ones that got implanted back, 'cause you choose the ones with the best quality, the 2 eggs, one belonged to one father, one belonged to the other father, but they have a common mother. They replay the concept of what's called superfecundation. And in fact, there are other cases like this. There is a case like this in England that I'm going to probably touch on. And there are cases like this in Italy. There are a number of cases like this. Some of them don't involve twins, some of them involve siblings, where one twin does not have the US father. So this is something I'm going to revisit. It's a new area for me, but I think it's going to be very exciting.
totally. So, but wasn't there something about in terms of gay research back in the day that siblings that where the one sibling is gay, the other one's slightly more likely to be gay than if they were both straight siblings, and therefore there must be a genetic. I think Dean Hamer had some of this in his book, The Gay Gene, which turned out to be
He did.
overly described in the title.
Yeah, he did. And there are a number of twin studies that show a genetic component somewhat higher for males, about 30 to 40%, than females, 18 to 20%. Lower than we previously would have thought, but significant nevertheless. When Franz Kallman did his work on gay twins back in I think the 60s or 70s, he said the concordance was 100% in identical twins. And why? Because of how he chose a sample. He went to gay bars, which is going to attract the concordant pairs. And then there was a study done by Michael Bailey some years later where they found about a 50% concordance rate, but that was because they sampled through magazines, gay magazines, things like that. When you go to population registries and you're not sampling with the intent of getting a specifically gay sample, then you get this somewhat lower rate.
The rate you gave of what was it, 20, 12 to 20% for
It was about
lesbians?
about 38 to 40% for males and about 18 to 20% for females.
Okay. And again, back to where we started, you would say, you would not say that's the heritability of it, that's the variation accounted for by genes, or how would you describe that?
That's the concordance rate. That's the concordance rate. That's different. That's
Hmm.
what's the percentage of pairs that you sampled would both be similar.
I
That's what
see.
that is.
Okay. But it certainly implies some genetic influence on homosexuality.
Of course it does. Of
Yeah.
course it does. Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. Another subject related to that, I remember Dawkins talking about being asked what would be the evolutionary origins of homosexuality, since without in vitro fertilization, you're taking people out of the population. Wouldn't evolution eliminate homosexuality? And then there was something like, well, it's the grandparent effects, or they're surrogate parents to their siblings, or to nieces and nephews. They help parent in ancestral populations or something like that. These always felt like just those stories to me. I'm not sure how you'd test that.
Yeah. There's
But
some suggestion of creativity and greater intelligence too. I've heard that story.
oh, right. But we probably don't know, right?
No. I mean, there's been mixed findings on everything we've mentioned so far.
Right. And do you ever get yourself mixed up into twin studies and IQ and racial differences and all the kind of hot button, now trans, all kind of the hot button cultural issues that are so politicized?
Well, I certainly do study intelligence in twins. I don't do race differences. I do within population studies. And, I'm convinced, having studied many twins raised together, many twins raised apart, and I have a study now that looks prospectively at young Chinese twins who were adopted apart indirectly because of the one child policy,
Mm,
where baby girls were abandoned because families were restricted as to how many kids they could have, and Chinese families prefer more boys if they can get them. So I'm finding genetic influences there. I mean, all the different ways of getting intellectual data, IQ data, from not just twins, but also adoptees. I have a study on virtual twins who are same age, unrelated children raised together, who replayed twinship but without the genetic link. And their IQ correlation is way lower than twins raised apart. There's another one that it's hard to explain without reference to genetic influence. So yeah, I do study intelligence. And what's interesting, Michael, is that if you think about the 4 or 5 studies of twins raised apart, the 2 in the US, the one in England, the one in Denmark, and the one in Sweden, the heritabilities, which is the MZA correlation, is about 0.7, 0.75 across the board. And these were tests
Huge.
not developed to assess genetics. They were put together to assess individual differences in ability. These were done at different times, different populations, different countries, different protocols, and different investigators. And so you don't find such robust findings too much in psychology, but there you have one. So again, um, your IQ is not, your intelligence level is not 100% fixed. You can be better at this, you can be better at that, but we all can't be the same, I think is the message. But I think that's nothing surprising or new.
Well, Nancy, that's a good message to end it on. I think what you're doing is like one of the most important things that anybody can do in all of social science, because you're tapping into the ultimate experiment, natural experiment, and how we've manipulated those experiments. The China thing will be interesting as that unfolds. And although I don't know how much accurate information you can get from the Chinese government these days, but I would imagine there's a data trove to be had there at some point.
Oh, I don't get the data from them. I get it myself. Parents contact me when they realize they're raising twin children. I get all the data myself.
Mm,
Yeah.
yeah.
I have a
Just,
paper that got published this year, in fact, comparing the intelligence in reared apart Chinese twins, reared together Chinese twins, those who've been adopted here together, and virtual twins. So 3 kinships with varying degrees of genetic and environmental relatedness.
oh man,
I'll
perfect,
send you a
perfect
copy.
experiment. Yeah. All right, Nancy, thank you for your work, for your new book, which is fabulous. And we, of course, provide links in the show notes of how to order the book, and we'll have introduced it before I turn on the podcast episode conversation with you. So I hope it does well, because it's an important book and well written, by the way.
Thank,
I mean,
thank you
it's
very
like a
much, Michael.
drama.
Always a
It's like a
pleasure to hear
drama
you talk.
unfolding. It's
Yeah,
great. It's like a movie. I loved it.
yeah. Yeah, I call it an academic drama.